Welcome, you guys. So today is Thursday, the day before the big conference. Super excited. Cannot wait. Woo! So Timothy Rosinski will be speaking tomorrow, and he's going to be sharing all about his fluency development lesson, all that great stuff. If you haven't signed up yet for Opportunity, the Science of Teaching Reading for online reading, writing, and ESL tutors, definitely want to make sure go to the link and click it. Today we're going to be talking about what impedes comprehension, what stops kids from actually understanding what they're reading. Some kids, they just seem like it doesn't matter what they read. They understand everything. And other kids, as they're reading, it's like there's a blank slate and you're like, what is going on? What is the difference? And that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I've got Justine Forelli joining me again today, woo woo, and Jessica Pizzold, who's joining us. And Jessica's actually one of our speakers at the conference tomorrow that you are not going to want to miss, where she shares all about the Kindle e-reader and how you can use it effectively in your online tutoring business. So before we get started, though, we're going to throw in our intro. Welcome back. Jessica, I can hear the beautiful birds inside of your background. Tell everybody who you are and where you are from.
I'm Jessica Pizzold. I'm from the Atlanta, Georgia area, and I tutor ELA and math, or at least my husband tutors math. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
So glad that you are here. Those birds sound amazing. I can't wait till I can hear those. We did have a beautiful day on Saturday. Our days come once every 14 days, it seems like. But you know what? We were able to enjoy a beautiful Saturday outside, doing lots of housework and cleanup out there, and it was amazing. And Justine, you are over in California. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I am Justine, and I'm teaching reading, math, and Italian to kids K through 8. And I'm living here in Lafayette, California, and it's another gorgeous sunny day here. And it's a little cooler. It's only going to be 64 today.
So good.
But on Saturday, it's going to be 74. So I'm looking forward to getting back to the pool. Started going to the pool in the mornings.
Oh my gosh, you guys have no idea. So it's 34 degrees here, and I am talking to people who are in my dream locations. You know what? It's really cool because I'm here in my basement. I'm just pretending that my day is just like yours out there. If you look out the window, doesn't it look amazing? I love it. So you guys ever wonder why is it that some kids just struggle so much with understanding what they read? What are some things that you've noticed with your kids that struggle with reading and understanding what they're actually reading? What are some things that actually impede their comprehension? What's the first thing that pops into mind for you?
Well, I have a list of 5 things, and I think the biggest one I was gonna wait and save it for last, but I guess let's just start with the simple one. I'm sure Justine would agree that one thing that will impede reading comprehension is just that the text is too challenging. So I'm coming at it from the perspective of students who are reading things that are required, like whatever they're having to read in school. It could be that the text is either, and I've got it written down, it's just too hard because it's above their reading level. So that might mean there's too many words, like the vocabulary is too either difficult to pronounce or just they don't know it when they see the word, and even if they hear it said out loud, they may not know. Also, sometimes the sentence structure, if the sentence is too long, they don't comprehend. If that text was written in the 1800s or 1900s, especially, I'm thinking of high school level, it's not reachable for them. And also it could be if the book is about an unrelatable situation or from an unrelatable time period, if you know nothing about history or where things are coming from, like a lot of people I think understand the Holocaust because there's a lot of emphasis on that time period. People like to learn about it, but pick another time in history, and even if it's historical fiction, if people don't really understand it, the student doesn't, they're robbed of enjoyment if they just have no background whatsoever, and if parents or teachers don't enlighten them, then they're just like, I don't know what I'm reading. I'm just reading words and they don't really make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've really hit on a lot of different points. First is text difficulty. If the text is too difficult for me, I'm going to have a hard time understanding that. And that should make sense. Like if I always give this illustration for people. If you are not a lawyer, but all of a sudden you're given those textbooks that lawyers are given and you have to read through it, you may struggle as you go through it because you don't understand all the lawyerese talk, right? And so it may be complicated for you. Or if I put inside, I give you a doctor's manual and I say, here you go, read this. And you don't know where like you said, the background knowledge. Let's say I don't know what the different parts of the body internally are called. How well would I do at really understanding what it is that I am reading? I'm going to have there's different levels of comprehension, right? We have like that surface level comprehension, and then we have the deep level comprehension. And so both of those may be impeded as I go through and read that. What are your thoughts about that, Justine?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you guys both just said. And then, so I just can add that another thing that I've noticed, especially like with some of my third graders, is that they have some bad habits like skipping words, guessing, substituting little words, and it just changes it enough that they lose the thread and they lose the what the sentence, so like on a sentence level, what it's actually saying. And so that's one thing I've noticed and been working on with them. And however, it's also interesting because sometimes even with that, like there's certain kids that can tolerate a certain amount of disfluency and still comprehend. And you're so surprised. You're like, how did you?
Those are my dyslexics. I swear, those are my dyslexics. Like they, it's like, okay, so they really struggle with the phonics part, but then the comprehension, I have a huge percentage of dyslexics that they just hold on to it. And you're like, all right, you got like 80% of the words only correct. Like 20% of them you were flibbering on, and you understand everything to a T. I'm like, I don't know how they do it, man. I really don't. It's unbelievable. They have a higher tolerance for inaccuracy than even other kids. Like other kids can read every single word correctly, and yet they don't understand a thing that they read. And it's an unbelievable situation. Now there are some kids where it is the amount of words that they're reading incorrectly that is causing it, and that's text difficulty, right? Like it's above where they're comfortable. Maybe they don't know the meanings of a certain percentage of words. And I tell people that it doesn't make a difference if I'm pronouncing the word wrong or I've never heard of the word in my life before. It's like the same kind of thing. To a student, if I don't read the word correctly and I just like make up and substitute it with a made up word, or I don't actually know the meaning of the word, it has the same exact effect on it. And it's always the one I find, like when I'm doing like my assessment on my students, I always find that it's the content specific words that they ask a question about at the end, and it's the one that they didn't know. Either they didn't know it, or they couldn't learn from it, or they couldn't figure it out based off of the information that they have. Sometimes I think there's an over-reliance of background knowledge for some kids. Like they can't actually take the information that they're reading in front of them. They think what they know already as fact. And it doesn't matter what is presented to them. It's like, no, that's not true. Where did that article come from? And I'm like, I'm glad that they're asking those kinds of questions, but at the same time, they're actually impeding their comprehension because all they want to do is tell me what they know instead of what they read. And they don't understand the difference. Like they're really struggling with that piece of it. So they'll do terrible on comprehension tests because they're like, well, that is different than what I know to be true. And I'm going to stick with what I know to be true. Like what I just read here is not going to change my mind whatsoever. And so they don't have that plasticity, right, to be open-minded with their thoughts. So I think that's another piece of it. What are the other things that you noticed, Jessica?
I think I'll go ahead and mention my favorite one now. So the one I'm most passionate about is that if reading is not modeled in the home or by other adults and teens in that child's life, then they're not going to be very practiced at it. They're not going to see it as anything all that important. They're going to see it as just something they have to get through. Like going to school is so often just checking a box for them. So if they've never been introduced to like the art and the love of reading, if it's just not being seen as something really fun, like if they've just accidentally never found reading materials that they liked, whether it be graphic novels or chapter book series, anything, then they just think it's boring and it's not fun for them. So when they are giving something that is a great book, they don't trust it because they see it as something just a very unfun challenge. And so they're just like, they're already approaching a book from a negative standpoint. And I've seen it many times before, but when you are reading through and discussing it with them, they'll start opening up, and then your hopes go up because you think, okay, this kid their comprehension can improve. It's just that at a surface level, they've got to be introduced. Most of them won't just naturally find reading. They won't be attracted to it without somebody leading them the way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's motivation, isn't it? Like motivation is a big key. If I'm not invested into what it is that I'm reading, I'm not going to put as much attention into it, and I'm not putting attention into it, then I can't retain the information that I'm reading. It's kind of like a cyclical kind of thing. What do you think about motivation, Justine?
Yeah, absolutely. I've noticed the same thing. And I think it also comes from like not having a purpose for reading. So that's really important, is to know your purpose before you tackle text that's difficult. And also interest, like you mentioned. So it's really important to be interested, because you can, if you're motivated and really interested in a subject and want to learn more about it, you can understand text that might be too hard for you, just because of that drive and that interest to do it. So both of those things, yeah, are super important. And I've noticed, like, one thing that I struggle with some of my middle schoolers is that their mothers, come to me and say that their child's reading comprehension is not good, and that they wish they were readers because they themselves are readers and have been avid readers all their life, and they wish their daughters were too. And so they come to me, and it's a little bit tricky because they're, first of all, like, these kids, their comprehension actually is pretty good. And it's just that they're just not like the way that their mothers wish they were. And I don't know, I suppose a lot of that comes today. There's just so many other things you can do when you're bored for entertainment. You don't have to just pick up a book like I did when I was a kid. Yep. I didn't have anything else. But now, there's just, right, they have everything at their fingertips, their devices. And so there's so many distractions and so many ways to be entertained or even find information. So it's tricky how to help those kids.
I wrote that down too. The same thing, Justine, is like distractions and addictions. I wrote down is like video games, TV, and phone. I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience too. I love reading, but there are many times I'll just choose video over a book because I'm tired, or I can't wait to see the next episode of the new TV show I'm watching. And I can only imagine when you're young, your brain is being wired to just be in front of that screen all the time. Like, I wasn't allowed to play video games as a kid, and it used to annoy me because I'm terrible at video games now when I try to play. But I'm actually glad now, because now I have the patience for reading. And I want to, I would prefer it. I know it's better. Well, I'm biased. I think that it's better than doing most other pastimes, because we constantly need to be learning. And so one way to learn is to actually read and absorb. It's quicker sometimes to do video, but reading, reading for pleasure is just, I think it's better for you. I think it's better for mental health. And so if students aren't used to doing that as kids, why would they? I can't imagine if I was an adult who had never really read, I think I wouldn't be interested in reading. It has to start at a very young age.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's something that is like constantly like instilled. And I know, like, it's so funny when you talk about like all these different things that are vying for their attention. The kids really do feel like that they can get every piece of education they need from TikTok. And I'm not making this up. Like, they really truly believe this. They'll tell me some hack that they learned, and I'm like, oh, how did you learn that? They're like, TikTok. And they're like, Mom, there's a lot of educational value on TikTok. You're totally missing out. And I'm thinking, I'm not, but thank you for thinking of me. I still prefer the old way of doing things and getting my information from books and reading and doing those kinds of things. But there is that difference, right? And there's so much junk on those platforms too that they don't realize that they're putting inside of them. Yes, you may have gotten this one cool fact that you'll be able to put into place, or this recipe that you can now cook. Awesome, kudos. But I would say that most of the stuff that they're watching isn't like that, right? And so they're kind of using that as their excuse because it's become an addiction. Being able to watch those videos, like they're very short. They keep their attention the entire time, right? That it almost takes away their ability to focus more attention on something that is a little bit more difficult to understand. And why bother? Why process that? Why take the time to be able to process it? But I mean, I was one of those kids that I honestly, when I read, I had, I have self-diagnosed myself because nobody had a name for this when I was a kid. It's called a specific reading comprehension disability. And I had it. I did not see anything in my head while I was reading. There was nothing. There was no picture. Even when my teachers read a book in class for a read aloud, I had no comprehension because, and a big piece of this is, I think a big piece of this is because my parents never read books to me. And so I didn't grow up being read to, although I had this really strong desire at a very early age to want to learn how to read because nobody did read to me. But then I didn't know how to process the information. I heard words, but I couldn't, there was no pictures that were there for me. And I do think that this starts at a young age when we're reading aloud to our kids. They begin to develop these mind movies inside of their heads. And then they have that ability as they begin reading, once they get through the choppy part of reading, right, word by word or sound by sound, once they get past that, they can begin starting to understand what they read. Well, that wasn't wired in my brain as of yet. There was no mind movie. So what do you think the importance of like being able to visualize and see what's happening on the page and be able to talk about it? How do you think that affects comprehension for our kids?
I think starting with picture books is a great thing to do. Like my niece and nephew, they're really young, and my sister's always putting new books on their Christmas or birthday list. And so I'll look and at first you're like, there's barely any words in these books. There are only pictures. But then you realize, well, that's how they're learning. They learn with images so that when they can graduate on to chapter books, sometimes like the Chronicles of Narnia, there are a few drawings in those books, which are nice, but then you don't really need them. They give you like an idea of what maybe the characters look like, especially if they're like fantasy. So then after a while, you do have to be patient with when you're reading selling the descriptions of things. Like you're reading about the sound of a bird chirping, you're reading about the splish splash of a waterfall. And it might be harder for kids who haven't had as much life experience. Maybe they don't go on family vacations, or they don't get out much in the world. That might be harder, but they just have to be introduced to images at first. And then when you are reading with them, or when they're reading by themselves, they need to be able to imagine. I mean, I was always imagining things because I don't know, I think they just have to be walked through. Like when you're reading, you have to pause and say, oh, what does this place look like? If they're talking about a cave, what is the cave? What does it smell like in there? Is there any light down there? Who lives in a cave, or what lives in a cave? And then you just have to, that patience has to be there, because there are books that when you read them out loud, there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs of describing the scenery. Well, there's a point to it. You might like dialogue better, but there should be an appreciation for the scenery, and that's just using imagination.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget the very first time it happened for me. My mom had gone to a parent-teacher conference, and the teacher was saying how I did really poorly on the state test. And she suggested to my mom that she sit down and read with me. Like she read a page, I read a page. And my mom picked out the book Anne of Green Gables. And I remember my mom sitting there reading a page, and then I read a page, and all of a sudden it was like this magical moment. I could actually see the flowers that were over the road, the road that the Cuthberts were going through with Anne, and her describing Avonlea. And I just remember it was like the very first time in my life that I'd actually seen a picture there that was happening like a movie inside of my head. And it was from that moment, it was like turned on. And it was like that. It's so amazing because I do think it stemmed from the fact that my parents didn't read to me, that it didn't develop when it was supposed to develop. And so when she began doing that practice with me, it was like almost like instantaneously beginning to develop. And she wasn't having the conversations about mind movies with me at all. There was no conversation. It was just her reading. She didn't know how to be a teacher or have these kinds of conversations, but it was there and I was seeing it. And so for us as teachers, we have that gift of being able to pull on out, what do you see when you're reading these words? You know, what do you hear? Like you had mentioned, Jessica, like if you take your background knowledge of this experience, what was that like when you were there? What was that like for you? And can you picture yourself there? Also, a lot of times when authors are writing, they try to write as if you're the main character in the book, right? That you can actually feel what's going on in that character's life and everything. And that makes it that's what makes it enjoyable. It's like you're having this other experience that you can't experience unless you dive deep on inside of the book. And I think a lot of our kids, they miss out on some of those opportunities. What are your thoughts, Justine, as you think about the whole mind movie and making that movie happen?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that it's really important for parents to read to kids when they're young and also even when they're still in elementary school. It's good. And yeah, and I think it's good for us still to do that. I think that's why kids benefit from tutoring with us, is because we can do that shared reading where I read a page, you read a page, and then we're modeling. And I think the way we know how to read fluently and pause when we're supposed to helps create that picture in their head for them, because a lot of these kids don't read very fluently. They aren't stopping where they're supposed to with punctuation. And so they're not, I think that also impedes that picture making.
It does. Yeah, when you combine those sentences together, right? It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense. How can you comprehend? You can't. Right. What were you going to say, Jessica?
I was thinking also tone of voice too, because when parents or teachers or tutors like us are reading out loud, the students aren't usually the best at reading out loud. I have one who's pretty good, but she's like, she does drama like on stage. But most students, they have to learn it's okay to use, like, to put emphasis on words and to show some emotion or whisper something. You know, it's when you do that, it makes the characters come to life more. Like a lot of people will just listen to books. They'll do like the audio. I mean, there's free stuff everywhere. You can purchase it, whatever. And some people, that's how they prefer to absorb a story. So if we as adults don't show them that, if they're just hearing a monotone peer reading out loud, they're especially feeling bored. So we have to show them, hey, it's okay. And sometimes I will be strict about that. I'll say, hey, don't mumble the word because it sounds like this, don't be afraid to speak it out loud. And why is this word in italics? You see how that word is slanted and the other words aren't? Why do you think that is? And we'll say why. And then the kids start being comfortable with putting emphasis on the italicized words or raising their voice if there's a word in capital letters. And that's because that's what characters really are doing. They're speaking in different tones and dynamics. You just have to imagine it in your head, and you can't imagine it in your head if you've never heard a story being said out loud before.
Yeah. And so making sure that we have the right fluency tactics, like which you're going to get to hear some strategies tomorrow with our amazing speaker, Timothy Rosinski. He's going to be talking about fluency, but fluency isn't just about speed, guys. Fluency is all of the pieces. I use this acronym SARE to always remind me what fluency really is. Smooth reading, accurate, at the appropriate rate, with the right emotions. And when you have those 4 pieces in place, that can help close the gap of what's impeding the comprehension of the child. So you just have to take a look and say, okay, not everybody's going to struggle in the same area. You might have some kids that they struggle with making mind movies. You might have some kids that they really struggle with having fluent reading. You might have some kids that really struggle with the vocabulary piece, like they just don't know the meanings of those words. And so if too many of those pile on up, if I've got more than 5 on a page, it could impede my comprehension. And then not enough access, right? If I'm not motivated to read all the time, then that's going to impede my comprehension, right? If the less I'm exposed to books, the more it's going to impede my comprehension. It's because it's a muscle. It needs to be worked. Mm-hmm. It is not just something that just grows by itself. We have to work at it, just like everything else. And by the time kids get to, what do you notice? By the time kids get to high school, Jessica, and you have these kids, they've struggled with comprehension the entire time. What are some of the things that really stick out the most to you that they struggle with the most as they get to this more difficult level text?
Well, I think like one of the first things I mentioned about how if the text is already, like, let's say if they're not practicing much in elementary or in middle school, in elementary they don't get what they need, so then in middle school it's still a little bit okay, like a little bit fun, like you'll read a book and study like Hatchet or The Secret Life of Bees or something. But then in high school, suddenly you're thrown into Shakespeare and you're not really told why reading that type of language is valuable. Like not all the time. It's just there. And then you're also reading books that are great. They may have great themes, but by then you're like having to struggle with the structure of the sentences, the time period, and then these new things like theme and tone and characterization. Suddenly they're having to deal with that. And a lot of the times they're not comprehending in any way because it's harder. And then they're nervous because when, let's say if they're reading out loud in class, they're just like, okay, when it's my turn, I just want to make sure I read out loud and I don't look stupid in front of my peers. They're not really registering what's going on. They just might want to make sure they're reading every word correctly. Mm-hmm. And if they're not, if they mess up and they get snickered at, and I just, my heart would go out to those kids. And so I'd say, you can understand this. It's just that, I hated that about the classroom. Like there's a book that I have to teach. It's not my choice. It's not the student's choice, but we all have to get through it. So the only way to enjoy it sometimes is if we're all maybe doing a project with it, or we're all discussing it for taking our time, then it makes sense. But yeah, like it's stressful if they haven't had enough practice and then suddenly they're not enjoying reading and writing about the book because the book itself just seems too daunting.
Yeah. And especially when we start talking about that old English, right? Like there are words that we don't use anymore in our regular English. And so now it almost becomes almost as difficult as nonfiction text for them because it's like they have to relearn like the English language in a way if they're using the old English as well. So language can impede comprehension if it feels like you're constantly having to figure out what every other word means. It is definitely above and beyond where some of these kids are at. And so for these kids where they have to access this text, like I always tell the parents that I work with, while I work on the gap, let's make school easier. Have them listen to the book. They're going to have a better experience and they'll still be able to take part in the discussions that are going to happen in class. And some parents are completely against it and others are like, oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, let's work on closing that gap so that we can raise their reading level up. But then for their classwork, let's have them listen to the book so that they can begin at least being able to be a part of the conversation, because otherwise they get to the point where they're like, well, I'm not going to understand it anyways when I read it, so why bother reading it? Done. I'm just not going to read it. If they go to class, they don't care that they're not part of the discussion. But, it's like we almost have to give them access through another doorway so that they can still be a part of those conversations where they are talking about theme and some of the more difficult aspects of reading. I always find, too, that when my kids are struggling with reading, different text structures will impede their comprehension. Not understanding, if I'm going to read a book about animals, what is the typical information that I would learn about animals? When they get really comfortable with the different types of like nonfiction text that they're going to read, that it actually prepares their mind for what they're about to read. Like if I come across a book about animals and I automatically start thinking, oh, I'm going to learn about, who their predators are, who's their prey, how they're born, where they live, or what food do they eat? These are the typical things that I'm just going to learn in every book about animals. If they don't have that prior knowledge, it's hard to kind of like categorize the information that they're learning and hold on to it. And so understanding the different text structures and genres will help them be prepared for the reading, like understanding that a mystery, like the different parts of a mystery, how is a mystery organized? How is a book about a country organized? If I'm reading about a place, I'm going to learn about who lives there, how long has it been a country, how many people live there, what do people do for jobs there, what's the history like, what is the land like. These are all the typical things that I'll learn about specifically, and if I have that prior knowledge, I can hold on to more information. But if I don't, it just makes it all that more complicated. What do you guys think about that piece of it?
Definitely. I agree. Text structure is definitely a component to reading comprehension. And it can be good to preview the book, like do a little picture walk and look at what's coming up in the different informational texts.
Yeah.
I had a couple book samples that I got them on the Kindle e-reader, and I was sharing it with my student, and I said, I have these two samples. And I said, I think both of these books could be great, but I'm going to let you choose one, but we're going to read the beginning of both books. And so we read 2 or 3 pages. And so he picked one, and he picked the one I thought he was going to pick. It was the one he picked was like more relatable because it was about a character he already knew. It was from a book series. And actually, I'd recommend it for younger readers called El Ray Jakes. And he goes through these little real life adventures, I guess, like in school, and he talks about different characters or different kids in his class and like boys versus girl competitions and all that. But it's just the job of the educators and parents to say, here's a book, you have to learn look at the back of it, look at the front. Yes, you can judge it by its cover. Look at when it was written too. I try to show them, when was this thing published? Because if it was published a long time ago, it might be not as fun for you to read it with them because it's older, unless it's just a great book like The Hobbit or something. You got to let them know what you're getting. Or here's a book, it's about someone who survived the Holocaust, or anything about historical fiction. They've got to know, like, what are we going to get out of this book? Is it just entertainment? Are we reading to learn something? It's got to be, just telling them the purpose, I think. Yeah. And then, but if they're reading for information is just like, if you're reading, like you were saying, if you're learning about animals or something, or volcanoes, just pick something you like and you'll see how it's organized. They have to see how information is organized. Mm-hmm. So that's a different type of reading than, like, if you're reading, I have this news article website called it's just newsela.com, and mm-hmm. It's okay. It's all right. But I noticed if you lower the level, let's say if I have, a 9th grader, I try not to insult their intelligence. You can select the higher level reading, but if you select the lower level, the sentences, they're still informational, but they're choppy. Mm-hmm. And that's probably better for lower level readers this is the underwater robot. This ship was found just a few days ago off the coast of Antarctica. The scientists found it there. It's kind of mm-hmm. like us down deeper, like this is boring. But for the kid, they have more access to it. So then they realize, I'm about to learn about the shipwreck that was found and it sank in 1915. And here's why it was interesting. You just have to sometimes you embellish a little bit. This is so great. You won't believe this article I found. And I think that helps.
Oh, absolutely, because it's Newsella is all about the lexile level, and so if you can bring down the lexile level, so it's text that they can access. That kind of brings us back to the beginning, right? Having appropriate level text in front of our students will help increase their comprehension. And when I'm teaching my students, I always tell parents, like, I'm going to bring the text level down so I can teach the skills and the strategies. If I try to teach the skills and the strategies at a text that is beyond where they're at, it is going to be extremely hard for them to have success using those strategies and to be able to do the skills after they're done reading. And so I have to bring the text level down so that they can access the information. Yeah, it's really important. One of the things I find that my students will do, and this is always like, this is my biggest pet peeve, is they skip the words under the pictures, the captions, and the headings. Any brand new kid that I start working with. And so I was working with my own daughter one time, and you know how like your own kids they just like tell you right out like what's going on. And so my daughter says to me, my teacher says I don't have to read underneath that picture. I go, well, I disagree, because the words underneath the picture help you understand what's happening in the picture, which then gives you a better overall idea of what's happening in the book that you're reading. So when we read together, you're going to read underneath the picture, because guess what? There is always a question. If you take a test, there is always a question about something that was in the captions that you're going to have to answer. And if
you have to know where to
you
go.
Won't know.
I mean, sometimes I think they read it silently to themselves, but you can't know that. You can't know.
Most of them don't. My students don't.
That.
No, my students don't.
Some of them, if they're very thorough, they'll read it out loud. Or I will when it's my turn to read. And then so when they see me reading it, plus I always start with, picture, caption. I'll say, what are the words underneath a picture called? Caption. That's, for some reason, I feel like they should know that. I tell them that every single time. And then we get into the story. But if they're doing, one big thing about reading comprehension is they'll have questions afterward. Usually in school, they'll have 5 or 6 questions that went along with the reading. And so when they see the questions, it's best if they say, oh, this question is talking about the life of a polar bear. Well, like the life of the polar bear. So I think there's a section, they have to know where to go instead of rereading the whole thing. Those wait, there was something I read about polar bears. I think it's on page 2. And then they see the header. And then they look. Yeah, and that is the difference between skills and strategies. Skills are things you can do after you have finished reading. They're not skills that you necessarily do while you're reading. Strategies are those things that you do while you're reading. So I summarize to make sure that I'm understanding. I make predictions. I am thinking while I'm reading. Like I may actually have comments inside of my head and thoughts. I might be like, oh, I don't know what that word means, or I wonder why they did that, or they may have a new question that kind of forms. So they're go through this process of asking questions and seeing if their questions get answered. And these are all strategies that they do while they're reading if they want to get to the level of being a good comprehender and understander. They can't just read the words and then just expect the words to do all the work for them. Like they have to be actively engaged with the words, know what they're saying, or even know when they lost track. Like, because we all do it, we'll be reading and all of a sudden you're like, I don't remember anything that I just read. I need to go back and reread that. So we reread as a strategy while we're reading to make sure that we're understanding, right? So all of those while I'm reading, making mind movies, summarizing, predicting, asking questions, looking for answers, making comments are all things that great readers will do when they're understanding the text. So if you have a kid who's not doing any of that, then you know that you need to help them develop that so that they can be better. Some kids naturally do it inside of their head. And those are the great comprehenders. Do I need to teach them those skills or those strategies? No.
I just let them be like, okay, they get it. They're good. They understand at a high level without having to go through this. But then you do listen to them, and they will stop sometimes, and they'll start saying like, oh, like, I bet this is going to happen next. You just can hear them like making the predictions and doing all the things that good readers do. So it's really cool. I often, do you guys ever have parents who say this to you? They'll say something like, they can read at a fourth grade level, but they just really stink at the comprehension piece of it. And then I think to myself, every time they say that, if they can read the words, but they don't understand, are they really reading at a fourth grade level? And I have parents who don't understand the difference there. Do you guys experience that as well?
I think a lot of people get hung up on levels, like grade level. Oh, they're not on grade level. I mean, if they're in school, yeah, grade levels will matter to them to a certain extent, but it's okay to read below grade level, like read things that they can access. I think parents worry about that because they don't want their student behind, but
right.
I'm trying to think of an example. Do you have one, Justine?
No, I'm a little bit confused by your question, Joanne. Can you repeat it?
Yeah. So I've got parents who will say, my kid's reading at a fourth grade level. And then they say, but they really struggle with comprehension. And I think, okay, well, they can't be reading at a fourth grade level if they're not understanding it, because reading is all about understanding what you're reading. So then I had to find out, where can they read the words and understand where they're reading so that I can get their actual reading level. So a lot of times, like, let's say it comes down to like second grade. And so then I have to explain to the parent, okay, your child's actually reading at a second grade level, and here's why. Because they can answer questions at a second grade level about what they read, but as soon as we increase the text difficulty, while your child can read the words, they're struggling with other things comprehension-wise, which is why they can't answer their questions. So for me, it's really helping them understand that your reading level is based off of your comprehension. If I'm not understanding what I'm reading, I am not reading at that level. Like if you're putting high school level text in front of me because I'm a high schooler, but I can't comprehend it. But if you put middle school stuff in front of me and I could comprehend it, then my comprehension level is at a middle school level, not a high school level. And so them just understanding that difference there of your comprehension level is based on where can you answer these types of questions. And if you can't answer them, then your comprehension level is a lot lower than that. And there is a gap that needs to be closed so that they can access it. And the way that I access it for them is I slowly and strategically increase the difficulty of the level, and we begin talking about what are some of the differences as the text gets more difficult. What are some nuances in this text? Is there vocabulary that needs to be introduced? Are there some larger words and multisyllabic strategies I need to be able to read? Is it that I'm just not making those mind movie inside of my head as it gets more difficult or as the words get more difficult? Am I reading too slow sometimes? Reading slowly, sometimes I'm putting so much effort into reading that I can't hold on to the meaning. So finding out, like, every kid is different. I love it. It's almost like a puzzle. It's like, okay, which pieces are missing for this particular kid, and where do I need to, close the gap for them in each of these little areas? I don't know. I absolutely love it. I don't know if there's necessarily a question inside of there. I was just curious if you had parents say that they're reading on one grade level, you do an assessment, you find out, okay, that is not their grade level because they were misunderstanding what a grade level is, like when it comes to reading.
Well, it's also the maturity, because I have most of my students are older students, and you don't want to give them a third grade book meant for third graders just because that's sort of where their comprehension is. You have to be tricky. Like, you have to find something that isn't going to insult their intelligence, but it's also like, I'm not going to give you, the art of war or something. It's got to be something you can understand. And it could be that parents might believe their child is on fourth grade level when they're not. It's like, because I know some things, I know some vocabulary, they've answered some questions correctly on some Lexile test, so it has the appearance of, or they're in the range of third grade to fourth grade. Well, they might not really be able to read and comprehend a fourth grade book that well, but they can answer some questions. Like they could,
Mm-hmm.
they're in the ballpark. They're just not quite hitting the home runs. So that's probably it. And then parents, they don't want to tell sometimes they're afraid to tell their own child, hey honey, you're behind. We don't want to be told we're behind in life and anything. So a child especially is like, the parents are just hoping. They're like, well, they're very smart, but here's the problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard facing the truth.
It is. It is. And I had one parent, she's like, I don't understand why what you're telling me is lower than what the school is telling me. And what I found out was the school was using an automated assessment, not one-on-one in-person assessment. They're using like iReady and using the data from iReady to tell the parent what their level was in reading. But iReady doesn't listen to them actually read. And it doesn't ask them open-ended questions. It gives them multiple choice questions. And so if you're really good multiple choice question answerer, you can actually look like you have a higher lexial level or a higher reading level than you do based off of that. So I think sometimes it depends on like what data are you using to make your determination, and understanding like what are the different assessments that are available and what kind of information will you get from that assessment to
That's
make
what
the best decisions.
the assessment data, that's there to support. Like I'll use a diagnostic test, but I know I'm like, we're not married to this. This is just here to give us some supporting, like to suggest some skills that we need to fill, but we're not getting on that thing every single time we meet.
Oh God.
So yeah, you can't just obsess with that, but you can use it to show, look, you've grown, like you now understand parts of speech, or it'll give them reading excerpts and they can answer them. They get better once they practice the skill. But yeah, the diagnostic, a person is much better to really find out what the students are all about and what they can do.
Yeah, that I think that especially when we're talking about reading, there's so many aspects that, if they're taking a test on the computer, you're going to get different results than if a person's actually listening to you read and can hear what you're doing and can see what types of mistakes that you're making. A computer can't tell that a kid is skipping over the periods and the commas. A computer can't tell, like a computer can't tell they could tell speed because you could like push like enter when you're finished, right? And so it could tell you speed, but in the head speed and out loud speed, there's going to be a difference, and there should be a difference between those two speeds. I don't know. Lots of pieces go into this, you guys. I mean, we've really covered a lot of them. We've talked about, that ability to make movies, that ability to, be thinking while you're reading, and, making predictions and summarizing, and, oh my gosh, the one that I hate the most was always inferencing. Reading between the lines they used to call it when I was a kid. And
Sure, that's all it is in high school. What can be inferred from this line to this line? I mean, it's like SAT prep too. Yeah. So I'm like, middle and high school, that's just what it is. And that's another skill that you have to figure out. And, or if you're reading out loud to them, I will stop and infer out loud, even though it feels a little silly. It lets them see what it's like.
Well, and that's, I think, makes for an effective tutor. Sometimes we have to spell it out for them because they can't. How can you make sense of something? It's like somebody gives you an idiom, but you don't know the meaning of that idiom. Well, how am I going to understand what I'm reading if nobody tells me what that idiom means? Right? And they'll use idioms inside of text that, that doesn't have the literal meaning to it, like raining cats and dogs, right? And we have tons of that will be inside of literature. So it is important sometimes to kind of think out loud, like, what does that mean? And kind of get their interpretation, like, what were you able to take from what you just read on this page versus, what was the deeper meaning behind that? And the more that we talk about what we're reading, the more opportunities we have to get past the surface level, which is where like book talks in schools, and reading what you're learning about, not just always watching a movie, right? But reading what you're learning about inside of textbooks and having conversations with other people about it. That is going to increase your knowledge skills at the end of the day. So, we all know that reading comprehension is a pivotal piece in kids reading. Tomorrow we're going to be doing some more stuff with reading comprehension, along with all the other areas and what science has shown us about reading and how do kids learn to read and what are some of the best methodologies to be able to utilize. There's always going to be a war on what is the best way to teach kids. And I think we have to step away from that war and really look at each individual child and see what is this child struggling with in the area of reading instruction. Is it phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, motivation? Are any of these things getting in the way of them being able to do the act of reading? If so, what are the strategies that we can do to improve it? So definitely come and join us tomorrow for the conference. It's an entire day. We are going to go from like 8:45 until about like 7:45 at night. So it is a full day event. You definitely want to take some time for it. If you're able to join us, make sure you sign up. And if you're not able to join us, there is a VIP all access pass that you can use and be able to get access to right away. So definitely check that out. We are going to be giving away swag tomorrow. We'll be giving away a year subscription of Raz Plus. We're going to be giving away a year subscription to wordwall.net. We've got some iWord kits that we're going to be giving, and then I've also made some specific swag for you guys that I've designed mugs and water bottles and t-shirts and bags and notebooks that you guys are going to get to win as well. So that'll be a lot of fun. So definitely come join us for the journey tomorrow, and next week we'll be sharing about like all the great stuff that we've learned. So tune back next week if you missed it, and you'll get to hear some of the recaps that we have about this amazing event. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you, Jessica and Justine, for joining us in the conversation all about like what impedes kids in their comprehension. I appreciate you guys joining us for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun.